Hi class, welcome to our fourth week of school. I cannot believe that the summer session is going by so quickly. We are past the halfway point of the session. And this week we're actually going to be talking about intercultural and gender communication. Before I get started with today's lecture, let me preface it by saying that when we talk about intercultural communication and gender communication, we approach several topics that can be uncomfortable. So in intercultural communication, we begin talking about inequality, racism, power. And when we talk about gender communication, we talk about heteronormativity, prejudice and discrimination due to sexual orientation and all of that. So usually when we spend a good section of time in intercultural and gender communication, we do come across all of these topics that tend to be a little bit touchy. But I encourage you to keep an open mind as you're reading the chapter for this week and as you are watching this lecture, because these chapters and these discussions that we have in intercultural and gender communication are not meant to hurt anyone. They're not meant to blame anyone. They are not meant to create more conflict. These are conversations that need to be had so that we can figure out ways to challenge those institutions of power to reach equity versus the idea of equality. So hopefully you enjoy this week's reading. And again, this chapter tends to be a little bit touchy. Usually when we are in a face-to-face setting, we work our way towards, through discussions and through activities, we work our way to getting comfortable about talking about these topics. Unfortunately, because it is such a short session and we're not meeting face-to-face, it is a little bit more difficult, but I want to encourage you to keep an open mind as you're reading the chapter and think about ways that we can challenge these power structures and how these power structures affect you or come to play in your everyday life. So let's get started. So before I actually jump into our lecture, I wanted to give you a little bit of background. So when it comes to intercultural communication and gender communication, there are two big subset or like two big areas that we study in communication studies. If you look at your course schedule or the course or like, the schedule of classes for Santa Monica College, the college offers a semester-long class that's just devoted to intercultural communication and a semester class that is just devoted to gender communication as well. Bigger universities at Cal State Northridge, which is the university where I work at, I teach the intercultural communication upper division course where we spend an entire semester discussing all of these topics. So I'm very familiar with this area of study. It's one of my specialties and one of the areas that I tend to teach over and over again. Intercultural communication began not so much as what it is now, which is kind of like challenging the power structure, looking at ways that we can reach equity, looking at discrimination, and all of that. It began kind of like a how-to manual. It was like anthropologists at the time and sociologists were kind of like looking at different ways in which we could get cultures to interact with one another without overstepping boundaries. So initially, the research for intercultural communication became from a sociological, anthropological perspective. We wanted to, globalization was on the rise when this field came to fruition in communication studies. So we wanted to find ways in which the United States particularly could do business transactions with other countries around the world without insulting cultural practices or rituals or anything like that, so that we could have like a very easy business transaction. However, like one of the things that scholars did at that time is that they would write how-to manuals on, how to deal with Japanese folks, how to deal with people from Germany. And if you look back into the field of communications, the scholars that were really, really big at the beginning of this field were Hall and Hall. and they're the ones who kind of like would write those how-to books. However, as we have moved forward, one of the things that scholars have realized is that when it comes to intercultural communication, you can't overgeneralize what one culture would do over the other. And these how-to manuals became an overgeneralization of how cultures would act. And it became problematic because that's how prejudice and stereotypes began. So I just wanted to give you a little bit of background on that. Let's get started. So for today's mini lecture, the objectives for today's lesson are, first, we're going to be focusing on defining not necessarily what intercultural communication is, but what culture is. And I'm going to give you like a little bit of background of what we study in intercultural communication. So next, we're going to talk about what gender communication is. And lastly, we are going to look at the difference between sex and gender, and I have a really cool diagram that I want to show you all that will help you kind of understand the difference between sex, gender, sexual orientation. So let's get started. So the first thing that we need to define before we jump into any discussion about intercultural communication is what is culture. When we talk about culture, the book and many scholars define it as belief systems, values, and behaviors that support a particular ideology or social arrangement. And you can find this definition on page 181 of the textbook. The way that I like to describe it is a culture is a group of people that come together that have a similar worldview, that pass on traditions, rituals, language from one generation to the next. That's usually the way that I like to see it. Now, one of the things that people often think about when they think about culture is that we think of culture as an ethnic group, religious group, a particular nationality and all of that. And although those can be cultures, culture can be attached to ethnicity, nationality, they can be attached to all of that. Also, culture does not necessarily have to be attached to those. So for example, if you're a really big fan of the Dodgers and you have ever gone to Dodger Stadium and watch a Dodger game, you can see that there are several practices that happen and occur at Dodger Stadium during a game. And Dodger fans could be considered a cultural group because they have a set of practices, they have a worldview, and a set of rituals that happen in that particular event. So culture can be attached to an ethnic group, to a racial group, to a nationality. However, it is not only that applies to those. It can also apply to common interests, music, and all of that. So anything that kind of brings people together, where we pass traditions from one generation to the next, where we have rituals and practices, that is a cultural group. And culture tends to affect our worldview, our language, rituals and practices that we have, and even your clothing. If you ever like a clothing at a park, or if you ever go to a park, you will see that the clothing represents the identity of that culture. One of the things that I like to do at the very beginning of my intercultural communication class is that I like to students an identity collage in which they look at different aspects of their identity, different cultures that form their identity. So we don't only belong to one culture, we belong to multiple cultures, and we not only have one identity, we have multiple identities. So for example, the way that I can describe myself would be I am a heterosexual Latina female, college educated, and I'm also first generation immigrant in the US. So those are all the categories that I would identify myself in. As you can see, I belong to different cultural groups. Another thing, so when we kind of define what culture is, and talk about intercultural communication, we're not only talking about what Hall and Hall came up with at the very beginning of the field, which was kind of like navigating cultural, make sure that we're being respectful of one another, but it goes beyond that. It goes into understanding the underlying power structure, underlying inequality, underlying discrimination, racism, and all of that. So we look at all of that when it comes to intercultural communication. So not only do how groups communicate one another and how to navigate that, but also how power plays a big role in it. One of the first concepts that we get to talk about in intercultural communication is the idea of race. And when we talk about race, it kind of falls into two areas. So initially, the way that we look at race is from a biological perspective. Initially, a lot of people thought that certain groups, certain racial groups had different qualities that would make them successful in one area or the other, and they attributed those differences due to like physical characteristics or biological characteristics. And there was even a time that even certain people would kind of like dissect different brains from, you know, from different culture, from the Black race and the white race, and they would dissect brains and they would compare and contrast to see what was like the difference that made one race good at one thing versus the other. And then they realized that there really wasn't much to a biological explanation besides the outer features that we have that differentiate us from one group from the next. And the other area that scholars focus on is the social construction of race. When we talk about something being socially constructed, which is something that we discuss a lot in intercultural communication, gender communication, is something that the power structures of society have created as the norm. But basically, there is no connection as to, there's no real reason, tangible reason as to why this should exist. So the idea that one racial group is superior to another, something totally made up, totally constructed to benefit a hierarchy out there. So we tend to focus a little bit more on the social construction of race because, again, besides the different features that we have that differentiate us from one group to the next, there's physically no other, there literally no other difference biologically that can say that one race can be superior to the other. So it is more like socially constructed. So again, people in power created this division and this hierarchy of what makes one race superior to the other due to physical differences. And when we begin talking about race, we begin talking about how, you know, this idea, this social construction of race is what created the hierarchy, which led to inequalities. And one of the things that I do in my intercultural communication classes, that we talk about how colonization, even from the very beginning, from Christopher Columbus and all of that, when we talk about colonization, we talk about how construction of race began at that time. In order for European countries to come and invade and take over and colonize certain lands, they had to have a justification why it was okay for them to come in and take over the land from these other groups of people. And that's how the social construction of race came about, that they're, you know, that they were superior, that these people were heathens, that their religion was superior. And that's how the social construction began. Once we kind of like discuss about race and we talk about how colonization relates to race, we begin talking about concepts that are related to race, which are these three concepts: racial discrimination, racial prejudice, and racism. These are three different concepts that mean three different things. When we talk about racial discrimination, we're talking about actual behavior that goes out there from an individual to another that, you know, manifests their negative views of a particular group of people. So if you have ever been to a store and you have seen a person be rude or be hyper vigilant over a person from a different racial group, you're seeing discrimination. Discrimination is actual behavior that manifests in your negative feelings towards a group of people. Racial discrimination is tied into racial prejudice because racial prejudice is the actual negative feelings that you have towards a racial group. And racial prejudice can be based on a negative experience that you've had with a person, or it can be just simply something that the media has fed into us, that we attach those negative feelings to a group of people. One of the things that you have to keep in mind is that racial discrimination cannot happen without prejudice. Prejudice are the negative feelings that you have, but you have to have prejudice in order for the racial discrimination or the act to happen. Those concepts are tied together. When we talk about racism, we're not talking so much at the individual level, which is the racial discrimination and racial prejudice. Usually, when we talk about those, we're talking about the individual level, but racism refers to the power structure, like government institutions, education, banks, and all of that, how power structures, social structures, discriminate against a racial group. So one of the things that we talk about in intercultural communication is how certain communities, certain communities that are like, predominant of like a race or an ethnic group or a nationality, how those areas tend to receive less funding for education and all of that. And that would be an example of how racism plays out. So again, keep in mind that when we talk about racial prejudice and racial discrimination, we often talk about it at the individual level. When we talk about racism, we're talking about power structures that discriminate against groups of people, that make it more difficult for them to succeed. And like I said, these are concepts that are very heavy, and we usually have more time in an intercultural communication class in which we talk about these concepts. But for the sake of our class, I'm just giving you an overview of what takes place in this course. Another key terms that we often talk about in intercultural communication are the idea of whiteness. When we talk about whiteness, we talk about how, the white race is the one that we, again, have considered to be the one that is superior and that is in power. And again, all of this is socially constructed, and it's tied to colonialism. When you think about it, these European countries were white, predominantly white. They came into other countries and they had to come up with a justification to take over the land or to treat people the way that they did. And, that's how it kind of all began. Even in the US, when we look at the United States, the first colonists in the United States were British and Scottish. And we saw that at that time, even when we had Italian and Irish immigrants coming into the United States, into the colonies at that time, there was a discrimination between the English settlers versus the Irish and the Italians, because they were considered to be less than. And the white race kind of like came about in the United States because groups like Italians and Irish and people of Jewish descent and all of that, because they were discriminated against by the other white groups, they kind of erased their culture, and it kind of became this whole like white group, because that way they could, not be treated as badly as another person who was not white. So again, when we talk about the white race, we're talking about the normative, or what the norm, or what the, who the group in power is. And this is the group kind of that sets the standards for the media, the superior ones, like what, even when you look at it, there was a time when advertisements, when the idea of beauty was a white person. And it continues to be so even nowadays, even though we are making strides to create some type of progress. But it's like the group in power is what we consider to be superior and all of that. And one of the things that we talk about in this class is how this idea of whiteness, usually when we think of whiteness, we usually cannot attach it to a particular country or culture. Again, like I was mentioning at the like a few minutes ago, it had to do with the fact that a lot of these white immigrants had to give up their cultural identity to fit into the white race. So there's no cultural identity, there's usually not a country attached to it, and you receive benefits. So, and the benefits can range from you going into a store and not being followed, or you being able to having like a name that sounds like the norm, and you being able to be given a job interview versus someone who doesn't have a white sounding name. And again, one of the things that we work towards this in our class is that the discussion of whiteness is not to blame one person. It's not a blame on a particular individual. So if you are a person who is considered white, it's not that we don't blame a particular person for this behavior. This system is this whole whiteness is systemic. Again, think about it. It traces back all the way to colonization. It's been a systemic thing that has been going on for centuries upon centuries. The reason why we have these conversations in our intercultural communication classes to make sure that we have conversations that can help us reach level of understanding, figuring out ways to challenge the power structure and making sure that we reach equity. When we talk about equity versus equality, it's another concept that we talk about in class. Equality says that everybody gets the equal amount of opportunities. So basically, everybody gets the equal amount of opportunities, and you do what you can with that. Equity, on the other hand, looks at how we can help these groups that are constantly being discriminated against and who have had the system against them for longer times, and it allows them to have resources to help them succeed. So it's not about just giving equal opportunity to everybody, but also providing extra help to get those groups that have been discriminated against, the minority groups, to meet other groups at the same level so that they can have the opportunity to succeed. So again, we're not blaming a particular individual. We're talking about systemic racism and the systemic inequality. And tied in with with whiteness, we have the idea of privilege. When we talk about privilege, is that when you belong in a group that is considered in power, it gives you certain benefits. So for example, if you are white, heterosexual, able-bodied, you tend to have more privilege than somebody who is white, part of the queer community, who has a disability, and who's low class or low education. As you can see, you might belong to the same race, but when you look at the hierarchy of events, it kind of puts you at a different level, depending on what is considered to be the norm or in power. Another thing that we talk about in intercultural communication is the idea of ethnocentrism. Ethnocentrism is the thought that our culture group or our nationality or basically our culture is superior to others. So whenever you have had a person who says like, oh, the way that this particular, my particular religious group or my particular culture group knows the truth and then or is the best compared to all the other ones, that's an idea of ethnocentrism. And the reason why ethnocentrism is problematic is because, again, it kind of puts this quality of what's considered good, bad, one cultural group or another. Different cultural groups have different practices, have different beliefs, and what might be considered good to one cultural group might not to others. So this idea of ethnocentrism is based on your knowledge of your race. We don't understand other religious groups, other cultures. We don't understand them, so we cannot say that our position is superior to theirs. It is naturally a human thing to fall into ethnocentrism, but cultural communication, we talk about how it is important for us to see where the ethnocentrism comes from and catch ourselves in that behavior and trying to find ways to challenge that in our own daily lives and also help us check ourselves when we're about to make those comments and have those thoughts. And ethnocentrism is based on this idea of standpoint. Standpoint means that depending on what cultural group, depending on what combination of cultural groups or cultural identities you fall into, that's the way that you're going to view the world. So again, if you are heterosexual, able-bodied, white, middle class, college educated, you're going to have a completely different perspective from someone who is white, homosexual, has a disability, low class, high school education. You are going to have a different worldview, and that is what kind of creates this idea of ethnocentrism as well. So hopefully, I know that this wasn't a long explanation of all these concepts. And like I said, in a longer semester, we would have much more time to explore that. I would have a whole lot more readings for us to discuss and break this down. And if our class was a little bit more face-to-face, we would have had a lot more deeper conversations, and we would have created this classroom environment to give us comfort But like I said, because the class is online and it's so fast paced, this is the best that I can do, giving you a little bit of like a little snippet of it. Gender communication is usually, again, kind of connected to intercultural communication because we look at power structures, we look at groups in power, we look at prejudice, and we look at inequality when it comes to gender, right? So the first thing that we need to discuss is define gender communication. So when we talk about gender communication, we talk about a specialization of the communication field that focuses on the ways we as gender beings communicate. So it focuses on how masculine versus feminine folks communicate. And again, watch how I'm saying masculine and feminine folks, because your biological sex has nothing to do with your gender. Your gender is feminine or masculine. Your biological sex is male or female. And one of the things that, a lot of scholars started looking at when it came to gender communication is games that children would have. So as we talked about in perception and self-concept and all that in that chapter, we usually have, the groups that we interact with, they kind of socialize us and teach us what is like right behavior or wrong behavior. And one of the things that we looked at is how children play, or how little boys versus little girls are encouraged to play. Usually masculine games are more about task oriented, like playing sports or having the games that have rules and that have winners and all of that. When we think about feminine games, when little girls are like taught how to play, it's more about playing with dolls and like make believe and all of that. And again, I'm not saying that little boys cannot play these games or little girls cannot, but usually the way that society has basically gendered each one of the groups is that, little boys play these games, little girls play these games. And one of the things that, we have seen constantly, like we have seen that like we're trying to make toys a little bit more gender neutral, that a toy can be played for boy and girl. But again, if you remember Toys R Us way back in the day, Toys R Us had a clear section for girls and a clear section for boys. And usually the color pink was attached to girls and the blue was attached to boys. And even nowadays, we still have that. So again, even from the moment we're born, we're being gendered. We're being told this is how a little girl needs to act, little girl needs to be feminine, little boy needs to be masculine. So the next thing that I wanted to talk about is the difference between gender, sex, and sexual orientation. And the cool diagram that I wanted to show you is this one that's called the genderbread person. And this kind of helps us understand the difference between all these concepts. So when we talk about gender, again, when we talk about gender identity is, like how you identify yourself. So you can, when we hear the term cis woman or cis man, is a person who, kind of like fall into like the heteronormative woman, heteronormative man. So have trans binary, which again, how would you identify? Are you she, her, him, or are you they, them, right? That's what we talk about gender identity. When we talk about gender expression is what you wear on the outside, or how you express yourself. So again, somebody who is extremely feminine might, wear dresses, flowery patterns, or something like that, or that, and feminine qualities that we attach. Or somebody who's extremely masculine might dress, what is considered masculine male, or might have those characteristics that are attached of like assertiveness and all of that. Androgynous, usually when we talk about somebody who's androgynous or non-binary, somebody who is neither female nor male. It's kind of like has qualities of both, is in the middle of the spectrum. And when we talk about biological sex and gender are two different things, right? When we talk about sex, it's what you were born with. So if you're born female, male, or you're born intersex. Folks who are born intersex are born with both female and male reproductive organs. And usually there is a surgery depending on the hormones that dominates for that that child, that's how they decide on that. But again, your biological sex and your gender identity and your gender expression is not connected to one another, right? You can be a female and your gender expression can be masculine, you know, or you can be a male and your gender expression can be feminine. When we talk about sexual orientation is who you are attracted to. And obviously there is a variety of, you know, in the LGBT plus community, different sexual orientations, and you know there's differences, there's a variety of that, right? And again, your identity, your gender expression, your biological sex is not connected to your sexual orientation, not connected at all. And this genderbread person helps us completely understand you think what you think, right? Your orientation is who you are, your sex is what your biological, and your expression is the way that you portray yourself. I think this like helps us understand it a lot better. Obviously, I know that I didn't do like a named job going through all of this, but if we were in class, we would have a deeper discussion of all of that, and we would talk more about what are some feminine and masculine characteristics. You know, what is your gender identity? We would have way more to talk about, but because this is like a brief mini lecture, this is as best as I can do. So hopefully this helped you get a little bit of an understanding of culture and gender communication. And if you have any questions or any comments, absolutely let me know. We do have one discussion post this week and we have 2 quizzes. So make sure that you take, no, I think it's 2 discussion posts and 1 quiz. My bad. 2 discussion posts and 1 quiz. So make sure that you complete that. I have some activities that will get you thinking about culture and gender. So make sure you complete that. I will be grading your papers at the end, sometime next week. And hopefully you have a good week and that you enjoy